Hi, thanks for joining us today. My name is Matt Greaves. I'm a marketing manager at SWAT UK. Today I'm joined by Andy Holton, SWAT UK's Deputy MLRO. Hi, Andy.
Yeah, hello, Matt.
Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So Andy's going to be talking to us a little bit more about anti-money laundering and some of the issues that firms are facing in relation to anti-money laundering. So Andy, I was quite surprised on reading a recent report from the ICAW that the due diligence in relation to anti-money laundering is still quite causing a bit of a problem for firms. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Performing the necessary due diligence is still causing many problems, which is unfortunate, as it means that the firms aren't complying with the regulations. And given that the regulations have been around for over 10 years now, it's a bit of a concern that that's the case.
Okay, so what are the common problems that firms are coming across?
Firms are generally pretty good at carrying out the basic due diligence checks, so looking at passports and company searches and things like that. But where they fall down is on risk assessments. It's necessary to carry out a risk assessment, and that should drive the extent of the due diligence work that you carry out. So if you're not carrying out the risk assessment, then that's a problem in terms of the scope of the overall work.
Right.
The risk assessment doesn't need to be anything elaborate, but it does need to be documented, and you need to update it every year, and then also make sure you then update the due diligence work as a result of any changes identified in the risk assessment.
Okay, so presumably different clients would pose different levels of risk assessment?
Well, that's right, yeah. If a client is based overseas, then they're more likely to be higher risk, and that also leads into another problem, which is beneficial ownership.
Right.
If you've got a typical UK-based client, perhaps a family-controlled company, it's quite obvious who the beneficial owners are.
Sure.
That's less clear if you've got share ownership that goes overseas through overseas companies and into overseas trusts. And the key point is you need to know who controls your client, who are you actually acting for.
Absolutely.
So obtaining information and evidence about that isn't as straightforward where overseas clients are involved.
Okay, so with an overseas client, typically the risk is going to be slightly higher. Is that necessarily the case? Or?
I think your starting point for the risk assessment would be that is higher, but obviously depending on the jurisdiction involved, that may well come down, and many places will be equivalent to a client in the UK.
Okay. All right, and are there any other problems that firms are finding in relation to AML?
One problem is to do with looking at whether a person is politically exposed or on a sanctions list. So if you're carrying out checks manually, it can be quite difficult to identify when that check is required and also actually carrying it out. So if a firm uses electronic checks, that can be far more straightforward, because the electronic check automatically addresses things like whether a person is politically exposed, whether they're on a sanctions list. When you're looking at electronic checks, the key thing is to actually consider the number of databases that electronic check looks at, and essentially the greater the scope of the check, then the more reliable that electronic check can be. And if you're using an electronic check, then normally that is all that you need to do.
Okay. So electronic checks in a way sort of make it a bit easier for firms to do that due diligence work?
They can make it a bit easier, but that does mean obviously normally that they come at a cost.
Right.
Whereas if you're just copying passports and utility bills and the like, there's no cost attached to that. But one element that has changed is the Institute Library Service has reintroduced its screening service, which looks at whether a person's on a politically exposed persons list, sanctions lists and the like. So if you're carrying out checks manually, then that actually can be quite an awkward part of it. So the Institute reintroducing that service is good news. A member can carry out up to 3 checks a week, so obviously in a larger firm you've got more members, so you've got a number of checks that can be carried out each week, and that then plugs that gap in terms of identifying whether a person is on a politically exposed list, whether they are on a sanctions list, etc. And there's more details about that service on the Institute website.
Right. Okay. So a really useful resource there.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. And let's say I've ID'd one of my clients, say 5 years ago. Is there any need to do sort of regular ID checks?
It's all driven by the risk assessment. So you should be reviewing the risk assessment every year. And if the risk assessment doesn't identify any changes, then you don't need to do anything.
Okay.
But if the risk assessment identifies perhaps you've got changes in trustees or changes in director or changes in the business that the company carries out, then you may need to do additional work as a result of those changes. So typically in a charity, the trustees change. You need to make sure that you're keeping your list of trustees up to date and that you've got due diligence undertaken on a sufficient number of trustees.
All right, I see. Okay. Well, that's great. That's been really helpful. Thank you very much for Andy.
My pleasure.
As Andy says, there's more information available on the ICAW website, so they've reintroduced that new service for checking against politically exposed persons. You can also find out more information about anti-money laundering and the training and support available from the SWAT UK website at www.swat.co.uk/AML.